Welcome to a Dark Souls Special Edition podcast, brought to you by Haunted Podcast with hosts Gary and Emily. If you love exploring the darkest, the most fascinating corners of history and myth, do yourself a favor right now. Take a second to like and subscribe to the Haunted Podcast. You really will not want to miss the incredible content they are putting out.
Yeah, it really is a phenomenal show, and we are absolutely thrilled to be teaming up for this exploration today.
Definitely. So to jump right into our deep dive today, I want you to imagine descending into absolute darkness. You are completely blind. The air is thick with the smell of ozone and centuries of decay, and the earth beneath your boots feels unnervingly porous.
Yeah, not a great place for a vacation.
Right. So you inch forward and you find this massive, jagged fissure in the cavern wall. You peer through it, expecting to see, the earth's mantle or maybe a subterranean river. But instead, miles below you, bathing the darkness in this catastrophic molten glow, is an ancient ruined dome containing a raging firestorm.
Which is just a staggering thing to stumble upon.
It really is. And today, we are not just looking at the underworld of Lordran. We are investigating a geological, biological, and sociological nightmare. We're embarking on an archaeological expedition into the subterranean depths, specifically, the catacombs, the tomb of the giants, and that ancient civilization ruled by Gravelord Nito.
And to do this properly, we have to kind of throw out our modern preconceptions about how cities are built and really how life and death operate, because we are treating this exactly as what it is, a real historical and scientific subject of study.
Right, exactly.
We are analyzing the geographical overlap of ancient cities, the sheer biological reality of necromancy, and the sociological structure of the earliest custodians of death.
So whether you are a dedicated historian of the First Flame or just someone sitting at home fascinated by morbid ancient civilizations, this deep dive is going to completely change how you view the so-called villains of the underworld.
Oh, absolutely. It's a total paradigm shift.
Yeah. So I want you to really put yourself in the shoes of an ancient cartographer for a moment. Usually when we study an ancient civilization, there's an expectation of clean categorization.
Yeah, I like things in neat little boxes.
Right. You dig up a Roman aqueduct, you map it on a flat grid, you date the stones, and the historian points and says, there it is. This was for water. It is comforting. We like our history to be visible, categorized and above ground.
But then you step into the archaeological records of Lordran, and suddenly that traditional historian's toolkit is completely useless.
Just throw it right out the window. The physical layout of Lordran is staggering.
It truly is. When you look at the records from ancient cartographers, their primary struggle was always verticality. This is not a sprawling, flat empire expanding outward like Rome or the Mongol Empire.
No, not at all.
If we look at the civil engineering of Lordran, it is an extreme example of nested subterranean urban planning. You have strata of civilization just folded over one another like a collapsed labyrinth.
Yeah, the geological alignments defy traditional earth science completely. You do not just have one city next to another. You have them sitting directly on top of each other, bearing the immense atmospheric and physical pressure of millions of tons of rock.
Which is an engineering marvel, honestly.
It's unbelievable. For instance, archaeological digs confirm that the catacombs sit directly beneath Sen's fortress.
Right, which perfectly explains one of the great geological anomalies of the region that baffled early surveyors for so long.
Oh, the waterfall, right?
Exactly, yeah. For decades, surveyors documented a massive subterranean waterfall deep within the catacombs. The rushing water carved these smooth pathways right through the jagged ancient rock.
But it's weird, because where is it coming from?
Right. Historians continually asked, where on earth is this water coming from? There is no open sky above the catacombs. The entire region is encased in solid earth and bedrock. It is a completely closed system.
I remember looking at early schematics and thinking, well, water does not just spontaneously generate in a vacuum. So how does an underground waterfall exist in the sealed cavern?
Well, you have to map the exact coordinates directly upward. If you drill straight up from that waterfall, you hit the foundations of Sen's fortress.
Wow.
Yeah. Modern geographical and hydrological analysis reveals a hidden, massive underground aquifer and this stream system flowing out from the incredibly heavy fortifications above.
So it's runoff from the surface level?
Basically, yeah. The water from the upper strata, which was likely drainage, or maybe a diverted river used to power all those traps in the fortress, is literally trickling down through the permeable bedrock. Over centuries, it eroded a vertical shaft, creating this roaring waterfall in the city of the dead below.
That is just wild.
It really is. It is either a brilliant intentional piece of civil engineering to provide running water to the lower strata, or just a spectacular geological accident that ties two completely different societal spheres together.
It really makes you realize how claustrophobic the design of this world was. You have the weight of an entire fortress bearing down on the ceilings of your crypts.
Yeah, just pressing down constantly.
But as tight and suffocating as it is, there are these breathtaking, terrifying vistas. Let's go back to that scenario I painted at the beginning. You are an early explorer. You have descended into the pitch-black abyss of the Tomb of the Giants.
A brave explorer, I might add.
Very brave. And you peer through that massive breach in the cavern wall, and far, far below, you see the demon ruins and the colossal dome of Lost Izalith.
That specific view is critical, by the way, for understanding the archaeological strata and the thermodynamics of Lordran.
Oh, for sure.
The Izalith Dome, which you can observe from that high vantage point in the Tomb of the Giants, is not just a palace or a city center. From an engineering standpoint, it acts as a massive containment vessel.
Wait, like a nuclear reactor dome?
Exactly like that, yes. The historical records tell us that the Witch of Izalith attempted to artificially recreate the first flame. In scientific terms, she attempted to ignite an artificial self-sustaining fusion reaction of souls.
Which did not go well.
No, it did not. The result was a catastrophic meltdown that gave birth to chaos demons and liquid fire. That immense stone dome was constructed, presumably by the Daughters of Chaos or Ancient Masons, to contain the thermal and biological fallout of that disaster.
But containment failed.
It failed catastrophically. If you look closely at the architectural remains of the dome through, modern imaging or detailed historical sketches, there is a massive structural breach.
Like a crack in the reactor.
Exactly. It is a colossal, jagged crack at the very base of the dome structure. Historians theorize this is the exact geographical point where the structural integrity of the containment vessel gave way, allowing demonic entities and liquid chaos to first escape and begin filtering into the upper strata of the world.
So if we look at a cross-section of this world, I like to think of this vertical stacking as a geological layer cake of disasters.
A layer cake of disasters. I like that.
Right. You have Izalith at the absolute bottom, leaking literal thermal chaos and demonic entities. And right above it, acting as the ceiling to this molten nightmare, is the Tomb of the Giants.
Which is packed full of rock and bone.
Exactly. So this makes me wonder, isn't Nito's domain essentially serving as a massive skeletal radiation shield for the rest of Lordran?
That is a brilliant analogy, and structurally, it is entirely accurate. Nito's realm operates as a critical buffer zone.
Wow.
Yeah, the dark, dense, death-infused earth of the Tomb of the Giants, which is packed with millions of tons of calcified bone and bedrock, sits squarely between the catastrophic mutating heat of Izalith and the sunlit world above.
So it's protecting everyone else.
Without that massive layer of absolute cold, still death acting as insulation, the thermal chaos might have simply burned upward and consumed Lordran entirely. Nito's kingdom was, for all intents and purposes, the world's lead lining.
It is wild to think about. You have this kingdom of the dead doing the heavy lifting to keep the living world from melting. And yet, if you go even deeper past the chaos of Izalith, you hit something that completely breaks the mind.
Oh, you're talking about the primordial world.
Yes. Ash Lake, which explorers have found deep beneath the Great Hollow.
Ash Lake completely challenges our very understanding of geographical space and time.
It really does.
When explorers finally reach it, they find a landscape that should not exist in the current era. It is a remnant of the Age of Ancients. You see giant calcified arch trees stretching up into an impossibly high ceiling, endless placid water, and a constant snowing precipitation of gray ash.
It is deeply unsettling just to visualize. It draws massive parallels to real-world folklore, right?
Absolutely. The cosmological structure of massive trees holding up the world immediately calls to mind the Norse mythological tree, Yggdrasil.
Right, which connects different realms.
Exactly, connecting realms of existence through its roots and branches. We also see echoes of the Valley of the Wind in its desolate, ancient, untouched beauty. But the sheer existence of Ash Lake sparks one of the most intense debates among historians and geologists today.
Which is this a literal physical place? Like, if I brought a heavy-duty drill and just kept drilling past the magma of Izalith, would I eventually break through a ceiling and drop into Ash Lake?
That is exactly the core of the debate. Some traditional geologists argue it is a literal geographical space located at the very bottom of the world's crust, like the foundational bedrock upon which the rest of the planet was built.
Okay, that makes logical sense.
But modern theoretical historians propose a much more terrifying metaphysical explanation.
I am bracing myself. What is the metaphysical theory?
They suggest Ash Lake is not a physical place you can just map with a compass. Rather, it is a permeating aura of the Age of Ancients.
A permeating aura, what does that mean?
Well, consider that the world of Lordran is fundamentally in decline, right? The first flame is dying, and as it dies, the linear progression of time and the strict boundaries of physical space are fracturing. Reality itself is degrading.
So things are literally falling apart on a molecular level.
Exactly. The theory is that Ash Lake might actually be the primordial past physically seeping through the cracks of a dying timeline.
That gives me absolute chills. The idea that you can just walk down a massive hollowed-out tree and accidentally step out of the current century and into a prehistoric era, not because you time traveled, but because the fabric of reality is so rotten that the past is just bleeding into the present.
Precisely. It is a spatial anomaly caused by the degradation of the universe's foundational energy.
Wow. Okay, let's move up a floor from that primordial soup and talk about the ruler of that buffer zone we mentioned earlier, the entity holding the line between the surface and the chaos. Gravelord Nito?
Ah, yes, Nito.
The first of the dead and the architect of the end. Because I feel like Nito gets a really bad rap as just a generic Grim Reaper figure, but he was so much more complex than that.
Oh, entirely. When we talk about Gravelord Nito, we have to meticulously strip away the folklore, the campfire ghost stories, and look at the biological reality of what he actually was.
Right, because he was real.
He was not a monster hiding under the bed to scare children. He was one of the original sovereign powers who claimed a lord's soul at the dawn of the Age of Fire. He was a foundational pillar of this world's ecosystem.
And his physiology was completely bizarre. When I first read the physiological breakdowns, I was stunned. He was not just a really big skeleton wearing a cloak.
No, not at all.
He was an amalgamation of bones, a collective biological entity.
Yes. The historical texts and fossil records describe a truly fascinating anatomical anomaly that completely breaks from humanoid evolution. For instance, his left leg was not humanoid in its bone structure.
I found this part so strange.
It is strange. It was constructed, or rather, it evolved over millennia, like the hind leg of a massive quadruped animal.
Okay, like a dog or a bird.
Exactly. Think of the joint structure, the digitigrade alignment of a large predatory bird or a massive wolf. The ankle is elevated and the animal walks on its toes.
Why would a humanoid entity evolve a quadruped leg out of hundreds of different bones?
You have to consider his environment. He lived in the absolute pitch-black, uneven, treacherous terrain of the Tomb of the Giants. A standard bipedal humanoid stride is incredibly unstable in an environment filled with jagged rocks, sudden drops, and dense mud.
So he needed better balance.
Precisely. A digitigrade leg provides significantly more shock absorption, balance, and tactile feedback from the ground. It was an evolutionary adaptation for his specific geographical domain.
But because it was only one leg, it meant he could not walk normally.
Correct. It caused him to walk with a slow, deliberate, incredibly heavy limp. He was physically tethered to his domain, lumbering through the dark, dragging this immense weight.
That paints quite a picture.
But even more fascinating than his skeletal structure is his biological defense mechanism. The records indicate he possessed an active, shedding physiology.
I need you to explain this to me, because shedding biology in a skeleton sounds like a contradiction in terms. Bones do not shed like snakeskin.
In a normal biological organism, no. But Nito was fueled by a lord's soul. We have recovered fragmented historical texts, direct observations from early explorers who survived encounters with him that describe a terrifying form of defensive cellular mitosis.
Cellular mitosis for bones.
Yes. When Nito was subjected to extreme physical trauma, say, struck by a heavy weapon in combat, chunks of his exterior bone mass would be violently severed.
Okay, so you chip his armor.
But rather than simply falling to the ground as inert calcium debris, these severed fragments instantly animated.
Whoa.
The immense necrotic energy within his body forced the bone fragments to undergo rapid autonomous reassembly, forming independent, smaller skeletons right there on the battlefield.
Let me make sure I'm grasping this. His armor was literally alive. You hit him with a sword, a chunk of his rib cage falls off, hits the floor, grows limbs, and immediately starts trying to stab you.
Yes. It is an extreme magical form of cellular division.
That is a terrifying biological defense mechanism. The sheer caloric or magical energy required for instant calcification and animation is staggering.
It is a brilliant evolutionary adaptation for a being that governs death. His very substance is self-replicating upon trauma. Any damage inflicted upon him literally multiplies his army.
And he used this biology, this mastery over the necrotic energy, to devastating effect in the ancient War of the Dragons.
He was instrumental in that war.
When we read the ancient histories, we always hear about Lord Gwyn using lightning to peel the dragon's stone scales, which, from a scientific perspective, is basically high-yield electromagnetic energy warfare.
Right.
And the Witch of Izalith used massive firestorms, which is thermal warfare. But Nito utilized biological and chemical warfare.
He was the ultimate equalizer in that conflict. Nito wielded the Gravelord sword, a massive weapon crafted from the densely packed bones of the fallen. But the physical slashing power of the blade was entirely secondary to its chemical properties.
It was a delivery system.
Exactly. He infused the porous bone of the blade with what historians call the miasma of death.
The records describe it as a lethal lavender-white toxin. How did it actually work? Was it just a strong poison?
It was far more advanced than a simple poison. It was an extreme biological agent, an aerosolized pathogen.
Okay, so it was airborne.
Yes, and the dragons were theoretically immortal because of their stone scales, which provided an impenetrable barrier against physical and magical attacks. The miasma of death was designed to break down that specific mineral and biological composition.
So it targeted the scales specifically.
It rotted the ancient arch trees, which were the very habitats and perches of the dragons, and infected the dragons themselves, causing rapid cellular decay.
So it was an acidic pathogen that dissolved their armor from the inside out.
Precisely. Without Nito's miasma breaking down their immune systems, causing their stone scales to become brittle and necrotic, Gwyn's lightning would not have been enough to pierce their defenses. Nito was the invisible architect of their extinction.
He was dropping biological weapons on a prehistoric ecosystem. It is incredibly grim.
Or usually is.
But here's where the historical record gets absolutely fascinating for me. You hear about a guy who drops biological weapons on dragons whose body is made of self-replicating bones, and you expect his kingdom to be a nightmare of torture, screaming, and sadism.
A typical underworld trope.
Right,
Yeah.
but when we look at the sociology of Nito's empire, it was incredibly organized, bureaucratic, and, well, peaceful.
It was a highly administrative custodian system. That is a great misconception about Nito. He was not a rampaging serial killer seeking to end all life maliciously. He was the manager of an inevitable biological process.
An administrator of nature.
Exactly. The gods of Anor Londo were obsessed with prolonging life, with defying the natural order. Nito simply managed the end of it. To handle the sheer volume of the deceased across the world, he engineered entire races of beings to serve as his administrators. The Finito, for example.
Like Gravelord Nagdane, who we have extensive historical records of from later eras.
Yes, the Finito were being specifically designed and woven by Nito to guard the undead crypt and manage the dead. Their entire philosophy, instilled by Nito, was that death is equitable and accepting.
It doesn't discriminate?
Exactly. It does not matter if you were a mighty king, a wealthy merchant, or a starving peasant. When you arrived at the crypt, the Finito welcomed you equally. They viewed the living world as a state of frantic suffering, ambition, and uncertainty. Death, in their sociology, was the great, quiet equalizer, a place of deep rest.
And he did not just create guards, he also created the Milfinito.
Yes. The Milfinito were enchanting singers. They were created with very little concept of ego or self, designed solely to sing and provide auditory comfort to the undead who are bound by the dark.
That's actually really beautiful.
It is. They existed to make the psychological transition into death soothing and peaceful.
I'm listening to you describe this ecosystem, and the only analogy I can think of is a modern-day hospice care system. It sounds profoundly benevolent.
It really was intended to be.
The Finitos are the hospice nurses, making sure your physical transition is secure and comfortable, and the Milfinito are the music therapists, easing your anxiety as you pass on.
A very apt comparison.
But this creates a massive cognitive dissonance for me. How does such a compassionate, equitable view of death coexist with the terrifying, heavily armed, spear-throwing skeletal armies that patrol the upper catacombs?
That raises a crucial question, and it is the key to understanding the great tragedy of Lordan's history. The peaceful quiet of Nito's domain was corrupted, but it was not corrupted by Nito himself.
Okay, so what happened?
The militarization of the catacombs was a reaction. It was corrupted by the desperation and the trespassing of the living. Which brings us perfectly to one of the most heartbreaking figures in the historical record, Pinwheel.
Right, Pinwheel. To understand Pinwheel, we first need to understand the macroeconomic system Nito built to manage the undead curse. Because Nito was not just managing corpses, he was managing the metaphysical energy of the world. Let's talk about the rite of kindling.
The rite of kindling was a profound piece of metaphysical engineering devised by Nito. He created a ritual where humanity, which in this specific historical context refers to literal physical fragments of the dark soul, could be sacrificed into sacred hearths or bonfires.
So humanity is a tangible fuel source.
Yes. By feeding this dense, dark energy into the flames, the ritual exponentially increased the life-giving, Estus-producing properties of those fires.
It charged them up.
Exactly. It was a vital macroeconomic system for managing the undead curse. It allowed the undead across the world to sustain their sanity and their physical forms longer by drawing on the reinforced power of the bonfires.
It was literally the energy grid of Lordran. And Nito held the patent, so to speak. He controlled the right. And then enter the usurper, the rogue necromancer known only as Pinwheel.
Pinwheel committed the ultimate heresy against the order of the world. He infiltrated the catacombs, bypassed the ancient defenses, and stole the rite of kindling directly from Nito's domain.
When you look at the visual evidence of Pinwheel in the historical texts, it is immediately horrifying, but also deeply sad. Accounts describe a creature wearing 3 distinct masks: the mask of the father, the mask of the mother, and the mask of the child. And in combat, it frantically creates fragile copies of itself.
The leading historical and archaeological theory paints a devastating picture of who Pinwheel was before the mutation. He was not originally a monster or a demon. He was a human being.
Just a normal person.
A desperate husband and father whose family met a sudden, violent end.
And we actually have archaeological evidence pointing to exactly who kills his family.
You do. Explorers mapping the catacombs located a female corpse hidden behind a breakable masonry wall deep within the crypts. On this corpse, they recovered the Dark Moon Seance ring.
Why is that ring significant?
The Dark Moon Blades were the secret police of the gods in Anor Londo. They were elite, fanatical assassins who hunted down sinners and enemies of the state.
So they were a hit squad.
Exactly. The presence of the specific ring on a hidden corpse in the catacombs strongly suggests that Pinwheel's wife, and likely his child, were killed by the authorities of Anor Londo in a targeted political or religious assassination.
So imagine the psychology here. You have a grieving father. His family has been murdered by the gods. He is driven completely mad by the sheer weight of this loss. So what does he do? He decides to break into the impenetrable stronghold of the god of death to steal the power of resurrection.
He wanted to revive his family. He wanted to undo the injustice. But necromancy is an exact, unforgiving science, and Pinwheel was operating out of pure, blinding desperation. He utilized Nito's stolen power, but the resurrection ritual failed catastrophically.
How exactly did it fail? What is the biological mechanism of that failure?
Instead of bringing his wife and child back to life as separate, functioning individuals, the flawed application of necrotic energy caused a horrific biological rejection syndrome.
Oh, no.
Their souls and their physical remains grafted onto his own living body. 3 distinct consciousnesses, 3 distinct souls, forcefully fused into a single, tortured biological vessel.
That is horrific.
That is why the entity wears the 3 masks. He is physically and mentally carrying the consciousness and the mutating remnants of his family within his own body.
And a cloning.
When he duplicates himself in combat, it is likely the fragmented consciousnesses of the mother and child trying to separate from the father, but they are too weak to sustain physical form, so the copies shatter instantly.
I really want you, the listener, to imagine the sheer willpower required to do what he did. You are a regular human being, and you decide to storm the gates of the underworld. You sneak past giant skeletons. You navigate absolute darkness and death magic purely to save your family.
It takes an unbelievable amount of courage.
And your reward for that impossible bravery is becoming a fused monstrosity, trapped forever in a dusty crypt. So I have to ask you, can we really view Pinwheel as a villain in this history? Or is he history's most tragic victim of the undead curse?
From a sociological and psychological standpoint, he is undeniably a victim. His actions, while heretical to Nito's carefully balanced order, were driven by the most basic, universally understood human emotion, love, violently twisted by grief.
Right. It's totally understandable.
But we also have to look at the objective consequences of his actions. By stealing the right of kindling, he destabilized Nito's administrative control over the catacombs. Pinwheel began utilizing the reanimated skeletons for his own defenses, forcing Nito into a defensive, militarized posture.
Which explains the shift from hospice care to a war zone, because Pinwheel and Nito were engaged in an underground Cold War, turning this ancient city into a heavily fortified bunker.
Exactly. It became an arms race.
Let's talk about the military fortifications of the catacombs. Because it was brilliantly designed, let's look at the necromancers, the undead mages who commanded the skeleton infantry.
The catacombs were heavily guarded by a specific elite unit of 6 undead mages. If you study their deployment architecturally, their tactical placements are brilliant.
They weren't just standing around.
No, they did not stand in the open courtyard or patrol the hallways. They were stationed at critical choke points, overlooking spiral staircases, hiding in alcoves across spiked bridges, and positioned on high ledges where invading forces would be forced into narrow, disadvantageous corridors.
They were not just artillery, they operated as signal relays for the skeleton infantry.
Exactly. If we look at this through a scientific lens, the mechanics of necromantic reanimation are fascinating. The skeleton infantry you encounter in the catacombs are not independently immortal.
They don't have their own batteries.
Right, they do not have their own internal power source. They are entirely dependent on a continuous broadcast of necromantic energy from their commanding mage.
Like a radio tower, broadcasting a signal to drones.
A perfect analogy. As long as the mage lives and maintains the broadcast frequency, the skeletons will reconstruct themselves infinitely after taking physical damage. You can shatter them into dust, and then the energy field will pull the calcium back together.
It is a highly effective, decentralized command structure. You cannot just fight the foot soldiers in a war of attrition. You have to cut through enemy lines and destroy the radio tower.
Exactly, you have to take out the mage.
But there was a very specific countermeasure developed by the surface world against this, right? Divine weaponry?
Yes. The clerics of the surface world developed metallurgical and magical techniques to forge divine weapons, specifically to combat Nito's forces.
Wait, hold on. I need to push back on this. You're telling me a holy sword isn't actually just blessed by a god, but is essentially an ancient EMP device. How does a piece of metal emit a counter frequency just by being forged a certain way?
Well, it comes down to the resonant frequency of the materials and the miracles infused into the steel during the forging process.
Okay, so it's applied physics.
Exactly. The necromantic energy operates on a specific low-band frequency that binds the calcium and marrow together. Weapons forged with divine or holy properties are designed to continuously emit a high-frequency counter-resonance.
Oh, wow.
When a skeleton is struck by a divine weapon, it acts as a localized electromagnetic jammer. It severs the invisible tether to the undead mage's signal. Without the binding frequency, the bones scatter and the reanimation cycle is permanently disrupted.
That is incredible. It is literal frequency jamming. It turns theology into applied physics.
Mm-hmm.
But, even if you have a divine weapon to jam the signal, you still have to deal with the most feared infantry unit in the history of the catacombs.
Oh, the absolute worst.
The unit that breaks the morale of every explorer.
Oh.
The wheel skeletons, bone wheels.
They are a horrific marriage of penal punishment and military application. To truly understand the horror of the bone wheels, we have to look at real-world historical justice systems, specifically the ancient torture device known as the breaking wheel or the Catherine wheel.
Right, this was a brutal method of execution where criminals were lashed to a large wooden wagon wheel and their limbs were systematically shattered with iron bars.
Yes. It was designed to inflict maximum prolonged agony. In the catacombs, we see undead corpses that have remained lashed to the very wooden wheels of their own execution. But through the cruel application of necromancy, these torture devices have been repurposed into devastating kinetic offensive vehicles.
How do they operate on a battlefield? Do they just roll at you?
The skeletons utilize the wheel to propel themselves forward at incredibly high speeds. They essentially turn their own instrument of death into a bludgeoning, rolling buzzsaw.
That sounds completely chaotic.
The centripetal force generated by the spinning wheel, combined with the jagged edges of wood and protruding bone, makes them capable of tearing through heavy armor in seconds.
It is dark comedy genius, honestly. But on a battlefield, it is an absolute psychological nightmare. Imagine standing in a dark corridor and hearing the high-speed rattling of wood and bone echoing towards you.
Yeah, that sound alone would send seasoned soldiers running.
I know historians often trace the cultural inspiration for these specific units to the Berserk mythos. If we treat Kentaro Miura's work as a parallel ancient text or folklore that heavily influenced the chroniclers of Lordran, the connections are undeniable.
Absolutely. The chroniclers of Lordran frequently drew upon the Berserk text to describe the horrors of their own world. The bone wheels are lifted almost directly from those mythic records where tortured souls are bound to wheel.
Right, it's a direct homage.
And similarly, Nito's greatsword, that massive, unyielding slab of dense bone, mirrors the colossal, crude weapons wielded by the mythic swordsmen in those ancient tales. It shows how deeply intertwined Lordran's military doctrine was with their cultural mythology. They weaponized their own folklore.
Okay, we have covered the geography, the biology, the tragedy of Pinwheel, and the military defenses. Let's move into the inner circle of the Gravelord. Because Nito did not just rule the dead, he had an elite cult of the living who served him, the Gravelord servants.
Joining the Gravelord servants was not a matter of simply signing a ledger or taking a verbal oath. It involved one of the most obscure, dangerous, and terrifying initiation rituals ever recorded in historical texts.
I read about this. It's intense.
It required a harrowing sensory deprivation journey designed to completely break the initiate's connection to the surface world.
Walk us through it. What did an initiate actually have to do to join this cult?
First, the initiate had to procure a rare biological artifact known as an Eye of Death. Once they had it, they had to navigate the darkest depths of the catacombs and locate a very specific open stone sarcophagus.
Okay, find the coffin.
But this sarcophagus was tucked away in a dead-end corridor, fiercely guarded by a territorial Titanite demon, a creature of immense, volatile physical power.
So just getting to the waiting room is a lethal trial. You have to slip past a demon that can crush you with a monolithic slab of Titanite.
Yes. If they survived that, the initiate had to climb into the cold coffin, clutching the Eye of Death to their chest, and lie perfectly still in absolute darkness for exactly 30 seconds.
30 seconds in a coffin in a crypt. I'm trying to wrap my head around this. Why exactly 30 seconds? What is happening during that time?
It was a test of supreme psychological endurance. The coffin was a conduit. Lying in total sensory deprivation allowed the initiate's consciousness to attune to the frequency of the abyss.
So they are dialing into a signal.
Exactly. If they panicked, if they moved, the connection failed. But if they maintained their composure and embraced the absolute stillness of death for that specific duration, the Eye of Death would activate. They were geographically and dimensionally transported deep into the abyss of the Tomb of the Giants, arriving directly at the foot of Gravelord Nito's resting place to swear fealty.
That is mind-bending. And what was their mission once they swore fealty? Because if Nito is running a hospice system, I expect his servants to be building crypts or weaving shrouds.
No, the Gravelord servants had a much darker purpose. Their mission was to spread disaster. They were tasked with using the Eyes of Death to infect parallel timelines and other worlds.
How did that work?
The initiate would crush an Eye of Death, which acted as a beacon. It broadcasted Nito's miasma into adjacent realities, manifesting as hostile, incredibly powerful black phantom spirits in those other worlds.
So they're invading other dimensions.
By sowing chaos, misery, and death in other realms, they caused the victims in those timelines to generate more Eyes of Death upon dying. The servant would then harvest these new eyes to offer to Nito, increasing his power.
Wait, they were basically interdimensional biological terrorists for the god of death. They were infecting parallel universes to harvest biological data for Nito.
That is a highly accurate, if blunt, assessment. They were the active vectors for his miasma, expanding his domain across time and space without Nito ever having to leave his crypt.
That is horrifying. But Nito's power wasn't solely hoarded by his servants, right? If we trace the timeline forward, centuries or perhaps millennia later, we see the echoes of his power intersecting with a surface group known as the Ledia Witches.
Correct. The Ledia Witches eventually made their way down to the Undead Crypt, which, as we discussed, was managed by the Finito. Initially, historical records suggest it was a symbiotic relationship.
How so? Did they help the Finito?
The Ledia Witches were elite scholars of magic. They studied miracles, pyromancy, sorcery, and hexes. The Finito welcomed them as guests, and in the spirit of equitability, they shared the secrets of the crypt. The witches gained access to the raw power of death.
That sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It was. Sociologically, access to absolute power almost always corrupts.
As it always does. How did they manipulate it? Did they start raising their own armies?
Worse, they realized that by understanding the deep biological mechanisms of death and disease, they could control it. They didn't just study pathogens, they engineered them.
Oh, man.
They began to manipulate the onset of diseases, and crucially, they controlled the curing of those diseases. They turned themselves into the gatekeepers of the crypt. If you were a suffering undead and you wanted the peaceful rest that the crypt provided, you had to go through them. You had to pay their price.
Oh, wow. They monetized and politicized hospice care. They took the one thing that was supposed to be free and equal for everyone, death, and turned it into a luxury commodity.
Exactly. And this was the ultimate blasphemy to the Finito. Remember the core philosophy. To Nito and his creations, death is equitable. It is a universal right. By hoarding disease out of greed, manipulating suffering, and gatekeeping the grave, the witches violated the most sacred foundational law of the Quint.
And what did the Finito do? Did they just stand by?
The response from the Finito was absolute, swift, and brutal. They branded the Lydia witches as traitors. The grave wardens abandoned their peaceful vigil, took up their massive blades, and slaughtered the witches to the last woman to protect the sanctity of equitable death.
It is a brutal correction to the system. But it shows how deeply, how violently the Finito believed in Nito's original vision. Death is a right, not a privilege. Nobody gets to charge admission to the grave.
A very harsh lesson, but an effective one.
But as we look into the deep future of this history, eons later, that original vision degrades. Time rots everything. Eons later, Nito's actual name is completely forgotten by civilization, isn't it?
Yes. The historical records of later kingdoms like Drangleic refer to him only in vague whispers as the Great Dead One. His identity, his empire, his philosophy, all eroded by time.
That's incredibly sad.
But the physical remnants of his lord's soul, that dense necrotic energy, survived in the deep earth. And those remnants eventually corrupted a simple, unnamed butcher deep within a subterranean toxic waste dump known as the Black Gulch.
This is the entity that explorers refer to as the Rotten.
Exactly. The butcher, hiding from the surface world, came into contact with the lingering mass of Nito's dark power. But without Nito's divine will to organize it, the energy mutated the butcher wildly.
Just unguided, raw energy.
It caused his body to organically merge with countless mindless hollows that had been discarded into the gulch. He became a massive amalgamation of writhing bodies, a walking sanctuary for all things tossed away and forgotten by the world above.
It is a dark, twisted mirror of Nito, isn't it? Let's compare them. Nito was an amalgamation of bones who organized a highly administrative, peaceful system of equitable death.
Right, highly structured.
And the Rotten is an amalgamation of wet flesh that just writhes in the dark, frantically embracing the abominations that society threw into the gutter. He is forever mirroring Nito's tragic legacy of communal death, but completely stripped of the administrative grace.
It is the ultimate thermodynamic and sociological degradation of an empire. What started at the dawn of time as a foundational, necessary law of the universe, the equitable, organized quiet of the grave, devolves over eras into a literal pile of rotting flesh hiding in a toxic cavern, just desperately trying to hold itself together.
Wow. Let's bring this all together. We have gone on an incredible, exhausting journey today.
A true deep dive.
We really did. We started by mapping the impossible architectural marvels of the subterranean catacombs, looking at the civil engineering and hydrology that allowed massive waterfalls to flow beneath sealed fortresses.
And we explored the terrifying chemical warfare of Nito's miasma dissolving dragon scales, and contrasted it with the beautiful hospice-like ecosystem he built with the finito and the soothing songs of the Milfinito.
We analyzed the heartbreaking psychological tragedy as Pinwheel, a desperate, grieving father whose attempt to cheat the laws of physics and death resulted in unimaginable biological horror and soul grafting.
And we traced the tactical, frequency-jamming military defenses of the necromancers, the psychological terror of the breaking wheels, and the interdimensional biological terrorism of the Gravelord servants.
We really hope this deep dive into history reminds you of the immense value in looking deeper than the surface lore. The underworld of Lordran isn't just a cavern full of random monsters waiting in the dark to ambush travelers.
It was a meticulously organized, philosophically complex society.
Exactly. It dealt with the absolute burden of mortality at a time when the rest of the gods in Anor Londo were desperately, selfishly trying to prolong their unnatural reign of light, no matter the cost to the world.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it forces us to deeply reevaluate our historical biases regarding who the good guys and bad guys of antiquity really were.
Exactly. So we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something to explore on your own. as you think about this world.
If Nito's original vision was a peaceful, quiet dark, where the dead were comforted by songs and treated as equals, and it was only the desperate, invasive actions of the living, like Pinwheel stealing power out of grief, or the Letio witches hoarding disease out of greed, that turned the catacombs into a militarized nightmare, who are the true monsters in the history of Lordran.
Wow.
The dead who simply wish to rest, or the living who refuse to let them.
Man, that is a question that sticks with you, just like peering through the mud and seeing the terrifying X-ray for what it really is. Thank you all so much for joining us on this deep dive. Remember to support the Haunted Podcast, keep questioning the history you were told, and we will see you next time.